Reading from OneTrackMinds. This is Peter Tatchell. There are many music tracks that have influenced me and inspired me. There are many I could have chosen to write about here, but the track I've chosen for this story, the track that perhaps helped me shape my life, is To Be Young, Gifted and Black by the fabulous Nina Simone. Now, if you know me, you may be asking yourself, what's that got to do with him? He's not black. It's a long story. And like all long stories, it starts with Once Upon a Time. In 1963, when I was 11, I remember hearing about the bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, where 4 young girls about my own age were murdered. I can remember thinking, even as an 11-year-old, how could anyone kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls, in church on Sunday morning? I was horrified. I cried. They were just kids like me, and that inspired my interest in and support for the Black Civil Rights Movement. The US was a faraway country. I was living in Melbourne, Australia at the time, but I made this connection that the rights of all of us are interconnected, and we have a duty to support all people everywhere who are suffering injustice. I grew up in a very evangelical Pentecostal family. My father was a factory worker, and my mother was mostly a housewife, though she sometimes worked in the local biscuit factory. All our life revolved around the family and the church. We only had 3 books in the house. One was an atlas, one was the Bible, and one was a book of Bible prophecies. I didn't have much in the way of horizons or expectations, but for some reason I connected with what was happening to black people in America. I saw this as a terrible wrong, and I could particularly relate to the civil rights struggle because one of the leaders of that movement, Martin Luther King, was a Baptist minister. And in my own childlike way, being brought up in this deeply Christian family, I could relate to his activism as the expression of the true principles of Christ's gospel. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Be a good Samaritan. Blessed are the peacemakers. I am my brother's and sister's keeper. So I used to follow every single newspaper, TV and radio account about the Black Civil Rights Movement. I was truly inspired. I thought to myself, this is what Christianity should be. Not just pious words and prayers, but social activism to get as close to heaven as we can on earth, to make those principles espoused in the Sermon on the Mount our reality here and now. It wasn't until some years later, when I was 17 in 1969, that I realized I was gay. And in my hometown of Melbourne, there was no LGBT plus rights organizations, not even any helplines or counseling services. There was absolutely nothing. Homosexuality was a serious criminal offence, which could be punishable by several years' imprisonment and even enforced psychiatric treatment. Gay bashing was the norm, often perpetrated by the police with impunity. So I had no model about what LGBT plus people could do to challenge our oppression. I knew and accepted that I was gay amazingly quickly, given my deeply fundamentalist Christian upbringing. After falling in love with a man for the first time and beginning our relationship, I remember thinking to myself, how can this be wrong? No one is being harmed. This gives both me and him immense emotional fulfillment. For me, the reality of being gay blew away all the dogma about it being wrong. I realized that when it comes to Christian teaching, Jesus Christ reportedly condemned many sins, but he never once condemned homosexuality. All those damnations were from St. Paul, who was a mere mortal, or were way back in the Old Testament. Moreover, the Old Testament also said all kinds of other things, like you must not wear garments with mixed fibers. It's a sin to eat shellfish. Men must not trim the corners of their beards. Yet no Christians in the 20th century were demanding adherence to those biblical laws and expectations. So having no template of my own, I looked to the Black Civil Rights Movement. I thought to myself, they've shown what LGBT plus people need to do. What they've done to win their rights, we must do to win ours. I reasoned in my own mind that if black people are an oppressed minority, then so too are LGBT plus people. And if black people have a claim for equality and social justice, then so do we, who are LGBT plus. I remember reading in the latter part of 1969 about a march in New York by gay people demanding civil rights. It was only a little news in brief, no more than 30 words. But I remember those words so very clearly. I thought, yes, I want to be part of that. I want to make my contribution towards the liberation of LGBT plus people. So I began to study even more closely the history of how the Black Civil Rights Movement overturned segregation in the Deep South and how they won voting rights. It was very clear to me that we LGBT plus were up against incredible hostility from the law and every social institution. Pleading for LGBT plus rights probably wouldn't work. Neither would traditional lobbying. We would have to use the same Gandhian tactics of non-violent direct action and civil disobedience as the Black Civil Rights Movement had done. It would require similar sacrifice, courage, and determination. We'd have to use protest to pressure an intransigent, ignorant, and indifferent society to acknowledge our existence and our right to equality. Initially, I tried to lobby members of parliament. I wrote letters to newspapers. They were all ignored. It was impossible to get anyone in the establishment in late 1960s Australia to take LGBT plus rights seriously. I can remember thinking to myself, boy, this is going to be a long, hard struggle. We're up against the homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, not just of decades or centuries, but of millennia. The consensus, historically and contemporarily, was that LGBT pluses were mad, bad, and sad. Being gay was deemed immoral, criminal, and unnatural. That was the dominant view. I knew to overturn this prejudice would take a huge, protracted struggle. Looking at the experience of the Black Civil Rights Movement, I calculated that it would probably take about 50 years in Western countries like Australia, the United States, and Britain to overturn legal inequality and discrimination and to change public attitudes. So I was in it for the long haul, but I never intended to make this my life's work. I began my activism part-time in the evenings and occasionally at weekends. I'd write letters to newspapers. I tried to interest and engage other gay people who I met through semi-underground gay friendship and party networks. I recall proposing to them the idea of setting up an LGBT plus rights group in Melbourne in late 1969, when no such group had ever been conceived, let alone existed. I was stung by their responses. They were mostly older gay men. Go away. What do you know? You're only 17. You'll get us all arrested. There was no recognition that we LGBTs had a claim for justice, just a strong fear of what might happen if we organised and campaigned. Apart from my partner, no one seemed to believe that we could fight for and win our rights, just like the Black Civil Rights Movement in America had done. I was inspired by hearing that one of the leaders of the Black Power movement in the US, Huey Newton, had in 1969 declared that gay liberation was a legitimate part of the struggle for the liberation of humanity. His declaration was extraordinary, given the level of homophobia in sections of the African American community at the time. But Huey was absolutely clear. Black people were part of a wider, broader struggle, and this included the movements for women's liberation and gay liberation. My thinking exactly. If we all worked together, stood together, and supported each other, we could collectively be stronger. When I came to London in 1971, age 19, I joined the newly formed Gay Liberation Front, the GLF, which is the first real mass movement of LGBT plus people in Britain. It was the first time ever that not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of LGBT plus people came out. The weekly GLF meetings had sometimes 300 to 500 people in attendance. There were no leaders. It was a grassroots, non-hierarchical democratic movement. We took on the government, police, church, media, and medical profession. GLF was also allied with other social movements. When the black activists known as the Mangrove Nine were facing trial on trumped-up charges, GLF was one of the few non-black organizations to stand in solidarity with them. Likewise, when the men's liberation movement held a mass rally against the sexism and misogyny of the Miss World contest in 1971, GLF was there with them. GLF wasn't just about equality. In fact, it wasn't really about equality at all. I don't think the word equality ever passed the lips of those of us in GLF. We wanted liberation, not mere equal rights within the flawed status quo. Our goal was the transformation of society to create a new sexual democracy for everyone, LGBT plus and straight. We challenged Puritanism, erotophobia, and misogyny, as well as homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. Our strategy was to join forces with everybody else who also wanted social change. So in 1971, GLF marched with trade unions against the Industrial Relations Bill to support workers' rights. We showed similar solidarity with Greeks fighting the colonel's junta, Spaniards resisting Franco, and the civil rights movement in the north of Ireland. So anyway, to get to the story of my song, To Be Young, Gifted and Black, I first heard it in late 1970 or early 1971. It had been released on Nina Simone's album Black Gold not long before. I immediately saw it as an incredibly proud, positive affirmation of Black identity and culture, which of course I supported. But it also spoke to me as a young gay man. I imagined the rewording of those lyrics as talking about LGBT plus people, how we were young, gifted, and gay. And like Black people, despite all the prejudice and hate thrown at us, we were also proud and determined to stand up for our liberation and freedom. I found this song incredibly uplifting and powerful, emotionally and politically. Sure, there were many other great civil rights songs that inspired me and which I embraced, but this song really struck a special note. It was saying to the younger generation of Black people, be proud, a better future is possible. You are talented and worthwhile. You can be change makers. I saw the song's core principles of pride and upliftment as being translatable to young LGBTs as well. Nina Simone was a great songstress of the civil rights movement and a great activist herself. She spoke and sang at many rallies during the 1960s to support the struggle for African American emancipation. I'm immensely grateful that To Be Young, Gifted and Black indirectly helped inspire my own LGBT plus self-affirmation and human rights activism.